The chandeliers cast a golden glow over the polished marble floor, the light glinting off silver cutlery and crystal glasses. The soft hum of refined voices blended with the quiet clinking of forks against porcelain. The waitstaff glided like shadows, their movements practiced and smooth, as if they had rehearsed every step on a stage. In the heart of the city, La Lumiere wasn't just a restaurant, it was a symbol. The wealthy came here not simply to eat but to be seen, to remind others that they belonged in a world of velvet chairs, rare wines, and prices that never needed to be read aloud. Maya adjusted the black apron tied tightly around her waist, her hands steady though her heart carried the weight of exhaustion. She had been on her feet since dawn, flipping pancakes at a diner across town before hurrying here for the evening shift. The pay at La Lumiere wasn't enough to erase her struggles, but it was better than anywhere else. Every extra hour she worked meant another small dent in the growing pile of hospital bills waiting at home. She thought of her mother's frail smile, the sound of labored breathing in the hospital room, and tightened her grip on the tray. Tonight, like every night, she told herself she could not afford to falter. Her eyes swept across the room as she prepared to approach her next table. That was when she noticed him. He sat at the corner, draped in confidence like a cloak. His suit was tailored so perfectly it seemed sewn onto his frame, every thread broadcasting wealth. His watch gleamed as he lifted his glass lazily, as though even the act of drinking was beneath him. Adrian Sterling, billionaire heir to the Sterling Empire, a man whose face appeared in glossy magazines beside yachts and mansions. He leaned back in his chair with the casual arrogance of someone who had never been told no. Around him, three companions laughed, their attention orbiting him like planets around the sun. Maya had heard of him before. Everyone had. He was the kind of man whose name alone parted crowds, whose reputation for arrogance was whispered in kitchens and boardrooms alike. Still, he was just another customer. She told herself that as she approached with a bottle of wine, pouring into crystal glasses with steady precision. Adrian's gaze drifted lazily to her, and for the first time that evening, his lips curled into a smirk. His voice cut across the room, sharper than the knife resting by his plate. "She probably can't even read the menu," he said, his tone dripping with amusement. The words weren't whispered, not confined to the safety of his table. They were spoken loudly enough for his companions to hear, and for Maya to feel them. The table erupted in laughter, cruel and careless. Maya's throat tightened, but her posture didn't break. Years of experience had taught her that sometimes survival meant swallowing pride whole. She steadied her breath, willing her face to remain impassive as she finished pouring the wine. Yet inside, her chest burned. She thought of the years she had fought for every step forward, the nights spent bent over textbooks, translating phrases and conjugations while the world slept. She thought of the endless moments of doubt, and the sacrifices her mother had made to keep food on their table. And now, here she was, reduced in a single moment to a punchline for a man who had never lifted more than a pen to sign a check. "Unbelievable," Adrian muttered, shaking his head, still smiling as though her very presence was absurd. His friends leaned closer, whispering jokes she could half hear, each one tightening the knot in her chest. Maya set the wine bottle down gently, her hand trembling only slightly. She forced herself to meet his gaze, though it took everything in her to do so. Her lips parted, and in a voice soft yet clear, she whispered, "Bonne dégustation, monsieur." The words rolled off her tongue effortlessly, precise and deliberate, the French accent sharp and unmistakable. It wasn't loud. It wasn't meant for the entire room. But it was enough. Adrian's smirk faltered, his brow furrowing for a brief moment. He clearly hadn't caught it, hadn't understood. His companions, equally clueless, only laughed louder. But for Maya, that was enough, a spark of quiet defiance, invisible to everyone else but blazing inside her like fire. She turned and walked away, her tray balanced perfectly though her pulse thudded in her ears. Each step carried the weight of her restraint, the anger she held back, the humiliation she refused to show. She knew what men like Adrian were, loud voices in expensive suits who fed on the silence of those beneath them. She had been taught her whole life that silence was survival, but tonight something inside her shifted. The laughter still echoed, but she could feel the storm building inside, one she couldn't contain forever. At the edge of the room, Maya paused, her fingers gripping the tray so tightly the wood dug into her skin. She thought again of her mother, of the hospital's white walls and the machines that hummed with every shallow breath. She thought of the sacrifices, of the endless times she had been overlooked, underestimated, written off. Adrian Sterling might have seen a waitress tonight, but she knew what she carried. She carried stories. She carried dignity. She carried a strength that no amount of money could purchase. And though she had walked away in silence, though she had let him laugh and smirk and mock, a quiet promise formed in her chest. Tonight, she wouldn't stay invisible. Tonight, she wouldn't stay silent. Her eyes flicked back to the corner table, where Adrian leaned back in his chair, preparing his next remark, another arrow aimed at her dignity. But what he didn't know, what none of them knew, was that fate had already placed a weapon in her hands, and she wasn't afraid to use it. The golden glow of the chandeliers seemed sharper now, the polished marble floor beneath her feet steadier than before. And as Adrian lifted his glass again, laughter spilling from his lips, Maya could feel it. The moment was coming. The moment where his arrogance would meet the edge of her fire. And it would not end the way he thought. The maitre d' glided across the room with the grace of someone who knew the power of subtlety. He held in his hands the evening's special menu, printed on ivory paper with curling French script that most guests pretended to understand but could not. He stopped at Adrian Sterling's table, lowering the menu with a bow, his voice low and smooth as he introduced the dishes of the night. Adrian's companions leaned forward with interest, but the billionaire's eyes barely flicked over the ornate lettering. He squinted, tilted his head, and let out a short laugh. "This looks like something out of a medieval manuscript," he scoffed, his tone carrying just loud enough to be overheard by nearby tables. "Who writes like this?" "Honestly." His companions chuckled politely, though one of them quickly buried his smile behind his glass, as if afraid to seem too obvious. Then Adrian's gaze shifted, sharp and mocking, landing squarely on Maya. She had been standing nearby, balancing her tray, prepared to move past with quiet efficiency. But he had noticed her again, and this time, his smirk deepened. He tapped the folded menu against the table once before extending it toward her, his words calculated to cut. "You," he said, his voice carrying across the quiet hum of the dining room. "Come here. Let's see something. Why don't you read this out loud for us? Let's test if you even know what it says." The laughter that followed was not kind. It rippled across the table like a cruel wave, a performance designed not just to humiliate but to entertain themselves at her expense. Guests at nearby tables exchanged looks, some amused, others uncomfortable, but no one spoke. Maya froze. The tray in her hands felt heavier suddenly, as if the weight of the room had settled onto her shoulders. A flush crept up her neck, her pulse quickened, and she could feel the sting of every eye watching her. Her instinct screamed at her to retreat, to take the safe road and offer a polite excuse. But her pride, battered though it was, wouldn't let her. She thought of her mother's frail hands clutching hers in the hospital bed, whispering, "Never let them take your worth away." The maitre d' stepped forward quickly, perhaps sensing the insult. "Monsieur Sterling, I would be glad to." Adrian waved him off without looking. No. Let's let her. Come on now." His tone dripped with condescension. "Read for us. Or can't you?" Silence spread across the dining hall. Even the clinking of glasses seemed to pause. Maya's fingers trembled for only a heartbeat before she steadied them. She set the tray down on the nearest sideboard, straightened her shoulders, and walked toward the table with deliberate calm. Her heels clicked softly against the marble floor, each step echoing louder than the last. She took the paper from the maitre d's hesitant hands, ignoring the way Adrian smirked as if already savoring her defeat. Her eyes scanned the words once, twice, the familiar shapes rolling easily into her memory. And then she began to read. Her voice was clear, steady, and sharp as crystal. The syllables flowed like water, each French phrase landing with perfect precision. Homemade rôti aux herbes provençales, servi avec un purée de pommes de terre à la truffe noire. Gasps came softly at first, followed by the silence of a room listening intently. Her accent was flawless, not exaggerated, not hesitant. It was the cadence of someone who had spent nights under a dim lamp translating page after page, who had practiced in whispers until the sounds were second nature. She read the entire section without a stumble, then lifted her gaze calmly to meet Adrian's. For a moment, his smirk faltered. He blinked, his jaw tight as though he hadn't expected to be challenged, let alone bested, on his own stage. His companions exchanged quick looks, unsure whether to laugh or stay silent. One of them murmured, "That sounded perfect," before quickly silencing himself under Adrian's glare. "Cute trick," Adrian said finally, forcing a chuckle. "You probably memorized that line. They must train you on 1 or 2 dishes to impress the guests. Clever, really." Maya placed the menu gently back on the table, her hand steady. "No, monsieur," she said evenly. "I studied in Paris. I didn't memorize. I learned." Her words were quiet but firm, each one landing with the weight of truth. The table went uncomfortably silent. Adrian's companions shifted, their earlier amusement dissolving into unease. One of them adjusted his cufflinks nervously, another avoided eye contact altogether. The balance of power at the table had shifted, and they felt it. Adrian leaned back, his eyes narrowing as he tried to recover. He lifted his glass, swirling the wine as though unconcerned, but the flush at the base of his neck betrayed him. "Paris, huh?" he said with forced casualness. "Working here doesn't really scream Parisian scholar to me." His friends chuckled weakly, though it was hollow, lacking the confidence of before. Maya tilted her head slightly, her expression calm. "Life doesn't always scream what we've lived, Mr. Sterling. Sometimes it whispers. But only those who listen can hear it." Her words lingered in the air long after she stepped back, reclaiming her tray and moving gracefully toward the other end of the room. The applause didn't come. This wasn't the kind of place where people clapped. But the silence spoke louder than any cheer. The power of the moment hung heavy, undeniable. At Adrian's table, the billionaire forced another laugh, trying to brush it off, but his companions weren't leaning in anymore. They whispered quietly to one another, their eyes occasionally flicking toward Maya with something close to respect. For the first time all night, Adrian wasn't the center of gravity at his own table. Maya continued her rounds, her heart pounding, but her face calm and composed. She felt the fire inside her still burning, but it was steady now, controlled. She had shown them one side of herself, but she knew Adrian wasn't done. Men like him never stopped at being challenged, they pushed back. She could see it in the way his jaw clenched as he watched her from across the room. He would try again. He would need to. His pride couldn't let her win this small victory, not in front of his audience. Maya steadied her breath, bracing herself. The night wasn't over. The storm wasn't over. And as she refilled a glass at another table, she could feel his eyes on her, sharp as knives, plotting his next strike. He would come for her again, of that she was certain. But this time, she wouldn't just defend. She would strike back. The night wore on, but the atmosphere around Adrian Sterling's table had shifted like the tide pulling away from the shore. Moments earlier, his laughter had rolled across the dining hall with the ease of a man used to being the loudest voice in any room. Now his smirk was forced, his glass raised to lips that barely touched the wine, and his companions whispered to one another instead of leaning toward him. Pride bruised, ego cracked, Adrian was not a man who could let such a moment pass. Maya felt it in the air as she moved between tables. The weight of his gaze pressed against her back, sharp and watchful. She had lived enough nights carrying trays to know when a storm was brewing, and Adrian Sterling was the kind of storm that refused to end quietly. She steadied her hands, forcing calm into each motion, even as her heartbeat thudded in her chest like a drum. Her chance to breathe was short-lived. Adrian lifted a hand, snapping his fingers with the confidence of someone who had always been obeyed. The sound was sharp, commanding, and it cut through the gentle hum of the restaurant. The maitre d' stiffened at the gesture, But Adrian ignored him completely, his gaze fixed only on Maya. "Come back here," Adrian called, his voice smooth but with an edge of steel. "You impressed the room once. Let's see if it wasn't just a trick." The table nearest him grew silent again. Other guests leaned back slightly, not wanting to miss what was unfolding. Maya set her tray down at a side table, her spine straightening as she approached. Adrian held the wine list now, his long fingers tapping it against the table like a gavel. "Translate this," he said, his words clipped. He pushed the page toward her with a little too much force, as if the paper itself were a weapon. "Tell me what this section says. Impress us again." The menu glowed under the chandelier's light, the script flowing in ornate loops. Maya's eyes scanned the paragraph once, twice. She didn't need more. The years she had spent pouring herself into language, into words that opened doors to a wider world, steadied her now. She lifted her chin slightly and began to speak. The words poured out with the same quiet authority as before, her voice steady, her accent crisp. Not only did she translate the passage, but she added context, describing the region of the vineyard, the subtle difference in soil that gave the wine its flavor, even the reputation of the harvest year. Her explanation painted a picture more vivid than the words on the page. Around them, other guests turned their heads fully now, openly listening. There was no scoffing, no laughter, only the sound of her voice carrying through the air, smooth and deliberate. When she finished, the room seemed to pause, waiting for Adrian's reply. His jaw tightened. His smirk was gone entirely now, replaced by a clenched expression that betrayed his struggle to maintain control. His companions shifted uncomfortably, their earlier amusement dissolving into something closer to shame. "Cute," Adrian said at last, though his tone lacked its former bite. He leaned back in his chair, swirling the wine in his glass. "Very cute. But don't think a few fancy words make you my equal. At the end of the day, you're still carrying trays while I'm signing checks." The cruelty in his words was sharp, meant to cut deeper than laughter ever could. He wanted to remind her of the gulf between them, to reassert the hierarchy he believed was his birthright. Maya's breath caught for only a moment. She could have walked away. She could have bowed her head, let his words roll over her, and moved on. That was what he expected, what he wanted, her silence to rebuild his throne. But something inside her refused to bend. She leaned forward slightly, her voice calm, steady, and far too soft for mockery. "You're right, Mr. Sterling. I carry trays. But I also carry dignity. And that's something money can't buy. Something you seem to have misplaced." The silence that followed was sharper than any shout. Adrian's companions froze, their eyes widening, their lips parting as though they had heard a slap echo across the room. One of them let out an awkward laugh, but it died quickly when no one else joined. At the edge of the kitchen doorway, a figure stepped forward. It was Chef Moreau, the Frenchman whose reputation alone had made La Lumière one of the most coveted reservations in the city. His tall frame filled the doorway, his apron still dusted with flour, his accent thick as he spoke in English. "Mademoiselle speaks better French than half my staff," he declared, his voice carrying over the hushed crowd. "If she ever wishes, she has a place with us in the kitchen, or at the front, wherever she desires." The applause began softly, hesitantly, from one table. Then another. Soon it rolled across the dining hall, a ripple of acknowledgement, not forced but genuine. It wasn't loud, not thunderous like a stadium, but in the refined quiet of La Lumière, it was deafening. Maya's chest tightened as heat rose to her face. She hadn't expected it, hadn't sought it, but for once, she didn't shrink from it. She allowed herself a small, measured smile before inclining her head in gratitude. Adrian's face, however, had flushed deep crimson. His glass trembled in his hand as he set it down with more force than necessary. The applause didn't touch him. If anything, it isolated him further, a spotlight exposing the cracks in his pride. His companions avoided his gaze, their loyalty cracking under the weight of embarrassment. Maya stepped back from the table, reclaiming her tray with the same steady hands that had once trembled. She turned to continue her work, her movements calm, her posture straight. Yet inside she could feel her heart pounding, not from fear but from release. She had done it. She had stood her ground, spoken her truth, and the room had listened. But she knew it wasn't over. Adrian Sterling was not a man who yielded easily. She had challenged his pride, stripped him of the armor of arrogance he wore so easily. And men like him did not retreat quietly. She could feel it in the tension of the air, in the way his eyes followed her as she moved through the room. He was plotting, recalibrating, searching for some way to take back what he had lost. Maya braced herself, knowing another test was coming, one more brutal than the last. The fire inside her burned steady, but she also knew storms never ended with the first strike. The applause had faded, the dining room returning to its hushed rhythm. Yet the undercurrent remained, a hum of anticipation. Guests pretended to look at their menus, to sip their wine, but their attention lingered on the corner where a billionaire and a waitress had locked horns. And as Maya passed the table carrying fresh bread, she could feel the eyes of the room still on her, not mocking now, but waiting, watching, wondering. Would she survive the storm that Adrian Sterling was bound to unleash next? Or would tonight end with a battle either of them had expected? The dining room hummed faintly again, the clinking of silverware and low voices returning as the applause died down, but the energy had shifted permanently. There was a new weight in the air, a kind of silent agreement that something important had just unfolded. Maya felt it with every step she took, each motion of her hand as she poured water or refilled a glass. She had not meant to turn the evening into a battle, but Adrian Sterling had forced her hand, and she had refused to back down. Adrian sat stiff in his chair, his wine untouched now. His companions avoided his gaze, though their every movement betrayed discomfort, shifting in their seats, fingers drumming against the linen-covered table. The billionaire's face was flushed, his jaw clenched tight enough to ache. His whole life had been built on control, on always commanding the stage, and tonight, a waitress had stolen it from him in front of everyone. Maya passed near his table again, her tray balanced effortlessly though her heart was still beating fast. She did not look at him directly, but she could feel his eyes boring into her, his silence heavier than any insult he had thrown earlier. She thought for a moment that he might try again, might summon her with another cutting remark, or attempt to reclaim his pride. But instead, Adrian pushed his chair back abruptly, the legs scraping against marble with a screech that cut through the room. He stood, tossing his napkin onto the table with a flick of his wrist. "This restaurant is overrated," he muttered loudly enough for everyone to hear, though his tone was brittle, lacking the casual arrogance he usually carried. "Let's go." But his companions didn't move. One cleared his throat nervously. Another glanced at his watch, mumbling something about needing to stay a while longer. Adrian's eyes narrowed, and for a moment it seemed like he might argue, but the weight of the silence pressing in on him from all directions was too much. He turned sharply on his heel and stormed toward the exit, his shoulders rigid, his expensive shoes clicking against the floor. No one followed. No one called after him. In a matter of minutes, the man who had commanded every eye in the room had walked out alone, leaving behind only the echo of his own humiliation. Maya exhaled quietly, not smiling, not gloating, just allowing the tension to release. She hadn't needed to chase him from the room. His own arrogance had done that for her. She simply went back to her work, refilling water glasses, clearing plates, speaking gently with guests who now looked at her with something that felt like respect. When the last guests had been seated with their desserts, the maitre d' approached her. He didn't raise his voice, didn't make a scene, but his eyes carried gratitude. "Merci, mademoiselle," he said softly, his accent wrapping around the words like silk. "You turned cruelty into art tonight. That is not something one forgets." Maya gave a small nod, her throat tightening slightly. She didn't need thanks, but it felt like a balm against the sting of earlier. She thought again of her mother, lying in that stark hospital room, telling her not to let anyone strip her dignity away. Tonight she had carried those words like armor. The evening wound down slowly. Plates were cleared, chairs tucked back under tables, the golden chandeliers dimming to a softer glow as the last of the patrons departed. The staff moved with tired efficiency, and Maya stayed until the final tasks were done, folding napkins and polishing silver, her body aching but her spirit strangely light. When she finally stepped out into the night, the city greeted her with neon lights and the faint drizzle of rain on pavement. Cars hissed past in the wet, their headlights streaking across the street. Maya wrapped her coat tighter around her shoulders, her breath visible in the cool air. She walked steadily, her shoes clicking softly against the concrete, every step carrying her further from the gilded world of La Lumière and back into the reality of her own struggles. Yet something inside her had shifted. For so long she had believed invisibility was survival, that to endure meant swallowing words and biting her tongue. Tonight had shown her otherwise. Tonight she had spoken, not loudly, not with anger, but with a calm strength that silenced arrogance and exposed its hollowness. She thought of Adrian Sterling, alone in whatever tower of glass and steel he had retreated to, nursing the bruise to his pride. He would tell himself stories to cover it, no doubt, blame the restaurant, the service, the so-called unfairness of being challenged by someone he deemed beneath him. But she knew better. He would remember her words, her voice, the way the room had turned against him. He would remember the waitress who read him like an open book, in perfect French. A smile ghosted at the corner of her lips, not triumphant, but resolute. She didn't fight for applause, didn't seek validation from strangers in gowns and tuxedos. She fought for herself, for her mother, for the quiet truth that worth isn't measured in wealth or power but in dignity. The rain began to fall more steadily, a fine mist that dampened her coat and clung to her hair. She tilted her head back, letting it wash over her face, her steps never faltering. The city shimmered around her, alive and unrelenting, but for the first time in a long while, she felt she wasn't just surviving it, she was standing in it, unbroken. By the time she reached the bus stop, her shoes damp and her hands cold, she felt the tension of the night leave her shoulders. Tomorrow would bring new challenges, more shifts, more bills, more quiet battles. But tonight she carried with her a victory no one could take away. And somewhere across the city, in a penthouse of glass and steel, Adrian Sterling sat alone, remembering the sound of her voice. The image of a waitress who spoke French better than he understood his own pride would haunt him. The memory of a room applauding her, not him, would gnaw at the edges of his confidence. And though he would never admit it aloud, he would never forget. Maya boarded the bus, slid into a seat near the window, and let the rhythm of the engine lull her. The city lights blurred outside the glass, streaks of gold and red against the night. She rested her head back, eyes closing for a moment, her heart finally steady. The world outside might still underestimate her, might still try to define her by aprons and trays, but she knew the truth now, more fiercely than ever. She carried more than dishes, she carried resilience. She carried dignity. She carried fire. And that fire could not be extinguished. As the bus rumbled forward through the wet streets, Maya whispered a single line under her breath, the words like a vow to herself. Respect wasn't granted by wealth. Respect was earned, claimed, and defended. And she had done exactly that. The night belonged to her. And the man who had mocked her would never forget it.